sitter. Okay, I would like to welcome you all to this seminar on UK's foreign policy in Europe after Brexit. My name is Pernille Riked. I'm a research professor here at NUPI, coordinating the NUPI's Center for European Studies and also our Europe seminar series. Before we start, I would just inform you that this seminar will be streamed so that you are aware of that. And it's good to see that you are not tired of Brexit. And you are right not to be, because it is really important. As you all know, Brexit has huge consequences for the UK, of course, but also for the EU and also for Norway. There are many aspects of Brexit. As an exit from the EU means that one has to rethink all policy areas, and as it affects both businesses and people. Brexit has really showed the importance of the EU and how deeply integrated Europe is. But today we will focus on one policy area in particular, and that is foreign policy. And more precisely, we will discuss how UK's foreign policy will look like after Brexit. This is an interesting question, as there is no precedent for a country choosing to leave the EU. The consequences for the UK's foreign and security policy are uncertain, and the impact on its role in Europe, and the world for that matter, is indeterminate. Defining the ambitions for a post-EU UK foreign and security policy will therefore be a major undertaking for the next decade. Through its current membership in the EU, Britain participates in a set of policies that structure its relationship between the EU and other states and organizations involved in international relations. With Brexit, this set of questions have to be recalibrated, and the question is how. An alteration of Britain's status in relation to the EU will also have the consequences for its bilateral relationship with both its EU and non-EU European neighbours, including Norway. So far, phase one of Brexit has not been finalised, and it is still uncertain how this will be finalised. Will there be a deal or no deal? And if it will be a deal, what kind of deal? It is in fact very difficult to see what kind of agreement we will see, if any, after the latest developments. But no matter what kind of exit we will see, hard, soft, messy, or even blind, I've been informed now that that is also an alternative, blind Brexit, both the UK and EU will have to start thinking about the nature of the future EU-UK relationship. UK has to start to think about how their foreign policy will look like. Will it be similar to the Norwegian one, which means that it is not formally part of, but closely linked to most aspects of EU's foreign policy? Or will it try to have a different approach? Adopting EU policies and aligning itself with its decisions and declarations without having a seat at the table and a right to vote, like Norway is doing, is perhaps easier to accept for a small country. But how is this acceptable for a country which still has some kind of great power ambitions, like the Global Britain strategy of Theresa May indicates? These are some of the issues that we will discuss in today's seminar. And we are also very fortunate to have Professor Richard Whitman here today to talk about these issues. Professor Whitman has been to NUPI several times and is also associated to our new research project on flexible integration in EU's foreign and security policy. And the abbreviation of this project is EUFLEX. He is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent, where he is also the director of the Global Europe Centre. In addition to that, he is an associated fellow at the well-known British think tank Chatham House. And he is also the lead editor of an important and widely read academic journal, Journal of Common Market Studies. His current research interests include Brexit and especially the future foreign security and defence policies of the UK and the EU. And we very much look forward to his presentation. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for coming. I think there's one outcome from Brexit, which is the traffic between London and Oslo is much more extensive than it's been probably at any time in its history. And it's very interesting that there is, whatever the pluses and minuses of Brexit, there is at least a kind of Anglo-Norwegian conversation which now has a different complexion, I think, from what it had before the Brexit process. So I would see my presentations as part of that conversation. I'm very interested to hear from you how you respond to my thoughts, because as the subtitle of my slide suggests, the answer to what Britain's future European policy is very much a work in progress. And it means it's a work in progress both in terms of the way that the UK defines what it wants from Europe, but it's also a work in progress in terms of what the UK's European partners want from the UK within Europe. And that means EU member states as well as non-EU member states. And I hope that we can pick up on that a little bit later. Now, Brexit itself is a multi-dimensional project. It's also a project that divides and one that is becoming increasingly difficult to have an understanding of all of its multiple components. And I think if we were going to do a sort of comprehensive job on Brexit, we'd probably need a week or so to run through the different aspects, the active aspects of Brexit. But I'm going to take a particular take. And the only thing I really want to say about how we ended up with Brexit is to, in effect, sort of tweet my own analysis of Brexit, which is that Brexit would not have happened without domestic politics. It would have not have happened without what is an ongoing civil war within the Conservative Party about Britain's place in the world and, crucially, Britain's place in Europe. And it would not have happened without an identity shift on the part of the British public, where we've had the rise of English nationalism, which is distinctive from identification with the UK, and the rise of the UK independence parties was reflective of that shifting identity or set of identities within the UK. And essentially, the referendum was the weaponization of an instrument of politics to sort of put it into the public domain. So it has obviously given rise to a particular political climate in the UK, one of which is important aspects of which are still working themselves out. And I think it's going to be a multi-decade, if not multi-generational project to actually work some of these things through. But thankfully, I haven't got to talk about that today. I'm going to take a much more narrow focus in a way, which is think about what the consequences of Brexit are, in effect, for Britain's place in Europe. And that requires us to think about Britain's strategy towards the EU, Britain's strategy towards Europe, and also what for shorthand I'll call the Global Britain strategy, which is the government's preferred label now for talking about Britain's place in the world. And I'd like to have presented this as a Venn diagram where you have overlapping circles, and I could have talked about what was going on in each of the overlaps. In other words, what's the relationship between the European strategy and the EU strategy, and the relationship between the Global Britain strategy and the European strategy and the Global Britain strategy and the EU strategy. And then in the middle, I could have distilled the essence of what Britain's foreign policy is now. But all of these things are a work in progress. And if you like, the sort of the organizing center of what Britain's foreign policy is and what Britain's foreign policy is about is very much dependent on what kind of relationship it works out for itself with the EU. And that is going to be a key determinant for the EU strategy, but it's going to be heavily conditioned by the way that Britain thinks about its place in the world and the way that Britain thinks about its place in Europe outside of the EU. So I'll try my best to stimulate or provoke in terms of looking at where I think the UK is at in terms of working out this European strategy. And the future, the near-term future, is very much dependent on what the UK's relationship will be with the European Union. And my own thinking, for what it's worth, just after the referendum was that I thought the UK would move itself into a position and in which it had a relationship with the EU, which was essentially an EEA-type relationship. It was going to have a relationship which was probably one that transitioned from being in the customs union to out of the customs union, and the UK would fairly swiftly work out a new kind of foreign security and defence policy relationship with the European Union. And clearly all of those things have not come to pass yet, primarily for domestic political reasons. But we are now obviously in the end game when it comes to the Brexit negotiations, and whether those negotiations achieve an outcome by next March, we'll obviously have to wait and see. A starting point for lots of thinking in Brussels about where the UK was going to go is this, I think encapsulated very nicely by this diagram that was produced by Mr. Barnier and his team in the Article 50 task force, which took what were the articulated British government positions on what were its so-called red lines when it came to the negotiations, and to then look at how that related to existing relationships that the EU had with third parties. And so in effect, to present the UK with a very stark illustration of how the choices that the UK made early, or the articulations of what the UK position was early in the Brexit negotiation process, limited the possibilities for the UK's future relationship with the EU. And I think the diagram does a pretty good job of illustrating where the logic of the UK-British government position is from the EU's perspective. You know, what the EU thinks is available if you put down these so-called red lines. And obviously the steps down are supposed to be instructive for the UK that your relationship is going downhill rather than uphill post-Brexit if you take certain kinds of decisions about where you put your red lines. And the logic, as it was seen from the position of the Commission as negotiators on behalf of the Member States, is that the options for the UK were very limited in terms of the trade relationship that the UK is going to have with the EU. I think what's surprising is that the UK discussion at the moment very much mirrors the EU's discussion. And despite the fact that Theresa May has sought to offer something quite different, we are in the UK now very familiar with the CETA +++, Canada-type relationship, or Norway minus. I'm sorry to apply minus to Norway, but that's one of the ways in which Norway's entered into the sort of British political lexicon, or the so-called WTO type option. That's the sort of space which I think is a very limiting space, frankly, both for Brussels and for London. But as I say, it's the logic of the position that the British government articulated and has articulated since it invoked Article 50. And if you look at the negotiations themselves, my apologies, do you have Specsavers in Oslo? Yeah? So if you can't read it, you need to go to Specsavers. This diagram is an attempt to sort of capture the complexity of Brexit, but to show how the British government red lines have actually been maintained through the Brexit negotiations. If you take a look at what the government has said, what the May government has said since May became Prime Minister, it shifted a bit on the phasing of the negotiations, but actually what it believes it's seeking, or what it believes are the preferable outcomes for the UK, have remained pretty static. The issue that's obviously come to the fore in terms of complicated things has been Ireland, the island of Ireland, the border on Ireland itself, which wasn't a significant issue within the referendum campaign, but has taken on a great significance now in terms of the withdrawal agreement. But if you look across what the British government has done, it has developed a more sophisticated articulation of what its position is on the red lines. It's tried to shift the terms of discussion and to introduce some new language, such as max fact for maximum facilitation when it comes to customs discussions and so on. But the UK has not really shifted fundamentally from what it's been seeking at the Brexit negotiations. So from the Barnier perspective, from the Brussels or Commission perspective, the options have been limited by the UK government's red lines. The British government, despite the sort of domestic political pantomime, has not really shifted substantially from the position that the government started to set out almost 2 years ago. And that means there's been a bit less flex in the negotiations than one might have expected. And really my sort of first point is, does this set the tone for the future EU-UK relationship? Is the lack of flex that we've seen on the UK side, which is a position which is determined by domestic political constraint, but also I think some inept handling of the negotiations, some poor sequencing in terms of decisions and so on. Does that say something about how the UK is going to approach the EU in the future, whatever the issue is? That the UK, in a way, has a fairly inflexible position on EU-type issues, which is determined by the domestic political context. And the fact that the Brussels considerations, the EU27 considerations, are informed by the desire to do no harm to the EU, to hold the line in terms of what it means to be a member, and not to necessarily punish the UK, but to preserve the notion of what European integration means, and absolutely crucially, to preserve the distinction between an EU member state and a third party, no matter how close you were on the last day of March next year. You become a third party the day after you leave, and that puts you in a very, very different category. So, say my first observation really is, how much can we learn from the Brexit negotiation in terms of setting the tone, the condition, and arguably some of the consequences for EU-UK relations in the coming period. That means, sort of Brexit date and beyond. And, this sort of position for the UK, of moving from a member to a third party within the EU is all very clear in terms of, the way in which the UK fits into EU decision-making processes, particularly European Council settings now, where you have the EU27 meet, and they meet as 28 also, but meeting as 27 is for different purposes and essentially to continue business as usual. But when they meet as 27, it's essentially for the purposes of Brexit, for the purposes of addressing the UK. So as the UK moves from being one of the 28 to being a third party or a third country, we might reasonably expect the UK's position on EU policy issues to shift. The UK, or the current British government, has said that it doesn't want to be fully aligned with the EU on the basis of its red lines in terms of Court of Justice, jurisdiction, doesn't want to be full participant in the single market, and so on and so on. And assuming, big assumption, footnote for discussion, if there is a withdrawal agreement reached and the UK moves into the transition phase, the UK's position on the EU is going to shift during the transition phase in the same way that the UK fitting into the EU shifts. And then beyond the transition phase, the UK's position and thinking about the EU as central to its European policy will inevitably shift. And it will shift, for example, if it is not a full participant in the internal market. I think it's reasonable to assume that the UK, during the transition period, is a full participant. the terms of access to the internal market, the single market, do not change until 2020 on the current terms of what the withdrawal agreement is. But post that date, when the UK is out of the internal market, it's going to have a much more ambivalent position on the internal market. The internal market, the single market, will, for the UK, potentially represent a barrier to trade. And regulatory arrangements within the internal market then will stand for something different for the UK, particularly if it's looking for distinction and differentiation in some areas such as services, which is part of the so-called Chequers deal that the UK has. Ditto on international trade and the EU as an international trade actor. That once the UK is out of the common commercial policy, once the UK is out of the EU's international trade policy, the UK is going to have a very different perspective on the EU. It will have a different perspective, which may be that it may seek to align with the EU as much as it can. And at the moment, the government's thinking, British government's thinking, is to essentially roll over all of the trade deals that currently exist between the EU and third parties. But the UK may start to think about the EU as a competitor, a quasi-competitor, or a barrier to the agenda that the UK may set for itself in international trade through the WTO and bilaterally. And that, I think, is a logical consequence of being outside the EU's trade policy. Not necessarily that the UK will seek differentiation, but there will be areas in which there will be conflict. And the conflict may well increase if the UK starts to articulate a very different vision of what it thinks the world trading order should look like, which is partly conditional on what goes on within the US, but also conditional on the way in which the UK thinks about how it should caucus with other members of the WTO. If you think about economic and monetary union, a project that the UK has not been a part of, I mean, the UK's position on economic and monetary union is actually probably to support further deepening more than anything else, because the UK probably wants stability in the European Union. The UK will not want to spend a lot of time worrying about the EU in terms of the other causes of instability which are apparent within the EU, and the incomplete nature of economic and monetary union is one of those. So you have a paradox in which the UK will be perhaps enthusiastic about more formal integration on the part of some other member states, because actually it doesn't have to fight the fights that it's had to fight as a member, which is argument for differentiation, argument for opt-outs, and arguments for retaining, a sort of distinctive British position within the EU. So it could become more relaxed. But on an issue like enlargement, the UK has championed while it's been a member, does it become more ambivalent? Does it become more ambivalent because the UK moves from a position as a member to being a non-member, and therefore countries which join the European Union it's not a zero-sum game, but are potentially lost to the UK in terms of the sort of organisation of states within Europe and the complication for British diplomacy. On issues like political union, I mean, the UK, I think there'll probably be a lot more continuity from now into the future, that Britain doesn't like the idea of the EU as a sort of politically unified actor, because that's probably bad in terms of the approach that the UK is going to have to the continent, and that I'll come back to in a moment. They're probably very ambivalent about sort of Franco-German leadership, for example, within Europe. I mean, it's essentially had a strategy of trying to break that down while it's been a member. It's probably going to feel much more ambivalent about that now, if that's a vehicle by which the EU advances some projects like economic and monetary union, for example. Common foreign security policy is where I want to go into a bit of depth, partly for reasons of time, but also because it's quite a nice way of thinking about what is an area that should be very uncomplicated for the future relationship with the EU, but is one that looks as if it's going to be far more complicated than I think most commentators up until recently thought it was going to be. And it's very dependent on what kind of deal gets struck in that area, which is a relatively under-institutionalized area, an area in which there is the opportunity for a sort of positive sum game, but still is proving to be quite complicated as an area in which you might be able to strike, a sort of post-Brexit relationship. So, but it's worth before we get on to the foreign policy, just thinking about the kind of ways in which the UK might think about its relationship with the EU outside of those kind of policy areas. Inevitably, the UK's interest is going to be to seek to have influence on the European Union. But as a non-member state, that's going to be on a very different basis. And obviously, it's going to have to do a lot more in terms of bilateralism. And I think the learning experience for the UK during the Brexit negotiation process has been the incredible unity on the part of the member states, when the UK has generally been of the view that the UK, the EU rather, is an organisation where sometimes you can worry away at issues with individual member states, and that helps you to gain some advantage in other policy areas. So the UK is obviously going to focus much more on bilateralism, but that's not going to be uniform, because it's going to be differentiated across different issue areas. But at the same time, I think it's going to be constrained domestically by the domestic politics. You know, the UK is probably going to face a constraint in terms of the degree to which it can integrate and do things with other countries, and obviously do things with the EU, particularly if it has a particularly threadbare relationship, you know, a kind of free trade relationship, a Canada type deal, but also the direct financial costs to the UK of doing EU stuff, or doing stuff with the EU, which is one of the reasons I think that an EEA type deal really wasn't much of a starter in the UK. The money question is quite significant. So for me, the difficult choice for the UK, to put it in, you know, slightly more technical languages, is how much the UK wants to be onshore and how much it wants to be offshore. You know, how much it wants to have influence within the European Union by real tangible engagement with EU policies, and bilaterally, particularly if it's constrained in doing so in cash terms, which is why the security offering is a big and important offering on the part of the UK, and how much it seeks to do offshore, in effect through trying to proxy influence through third country capitals, and to have influence on the way in which EU policy develops, particularly on the single market and allied areas, and how far it's actually able to do that in national capitals, because it's been demonstrated to the UK it's really difficult to do it direct with Brussels as a quasi third country, which is what the UK has been in the Brexit negotiations. And for me, you know, this is the sort of area of debate for the UK essentially, when we think about what the UK's policy towards the EU is going to be into the future. But I want to just have a quick look at the foreign policy areas, because as I say, it's an area in which I think there are, most commentators thought there were quick wins, should be easy to do a deal between the EU and the UK. And certainly if you look at the Prime Minister May's speech from Lancaster House onwards, there's been essentially two legs to the British strategy, and the aspirations for Britain's future relationship with the EU, which is the economic relationship, the trade relationship, and the security relationship. And really, I think this is going to be a very nice area for thinking about how far there are possibilities for having a third-party relationship between the EU and another non-member state, in a way, as the British government would see it, setting a different standard from what exists with third countries at the moment. And I think that the argument is essentially one around the degree to which the UK is integrated or reintegrated back into the EU, sort of foreign and security policy making order, the degree to which the UK is associated, which is a more looser relationship, or the degree to which the UK becomes detached and goes off and does other things and has other sets of priorities which are different from working with the EU. I think essentially the British government's position was that it wanted to, in effect, reintegrate, wanted to become heavily integrated. I mean, the joke was made, I think, after the speech that Theresa May gave at Lancaster House, that in many ways Britain in the security policy area was seeking to be more Catholic than the Pope. You know, it's seeking to have a more enthusiastic, a more developed relationship on foreign security policy issues than it has had as a member state. But if you look at the response from Brussels that we'll take a look at the moment, it's suggesting a very different kind of relationship. And over the next few months, it'll be interesting to see whether there's any closing in the gap between the two sides. I think it's probably best to think about the foreign policy relationship separate from the trade relationship between the EU and the UK as a recalibration exercise. And it's a recalibration exercise because the UK's interests are not going to shift overnight, because the UK has been involved in the foreign and security policy making process of the European Union. So it's reasonable to expect, and I think this is played out certainly on the sort of Iran dossier and the Iran deal, that the UK is much more allied with its European partners than it is with the US, because it's very clear that the UK's interests are shared. But at the same time, there's quite a lot of stress if you look at Brussels-based actors, Mrs. Mogherini, Mr. Barnier and so on, to keep drawing the member-non-member state distinction, to reinforce that point that the UK will be a third country, it will not be involved in the decision-making process in the way that it has been in the past. And so it's great if the UK wants to sign up to EU policy, but it cannot expect to play a role in Brussels in the same way that it has played a role in the past. And in areas in which you have quite stark institutional divides or member-non-member state distinctions, for example, on the Galileo project, you know, I think it's quite understandable that this has already thrown up quite a lot of heat. From the UK perspective, it doesn't understand how you can suddenly go from, in effect, what is a country which is a participant to a country that looks like a threat. You know, why can we not share this stuff? We've been involved in building it, you know. But from the EU's perspective, you are a third country, and a third country sits into a particular relationship with the EU on a major industrial undertaking like Galileo. And I think Galileo, certainly for those who work on the foreign and security policy dossiers in London, was a moment of significant shock and a moment in which there started to be a shift of emphasis, I think, in thinking about what the limit of possibilities were in the security policy area for the UK's future relationship with the EU. But saying that, in this area, I think one of the striking things is that there is very little debate in other member states about their ideal type foreign and security policy relationship with the UK in the future. So we're in a peculiar situation in which you have what is in effect a sort of major geopolitical consideration on the part of the EU. Do you want to have a good neighbour? Do you want a closely integrated relationship with the UK? But it's largely being thought about in technical and institutional terms, rather than in terms of, you know, what might be a more appropriate, bigger picture consideration in terms of the way the UK fits in. So it's really striking, actually, the silence in other capitals, whether from think tanks or from sort of government pronouncements on this issue of the sort of foreign and security policy relationship. So the trade issues have trumped the foreign and security policy considerations. And this might in some way become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the UK feeling that during this phase of the negotiations it's really difficult to get traction in the foreign and security policy area, that it has implications for the wider European strategy for the UK. In other words, you know, whether bypassing Brussels is the strategy that the UK should adopt, or even when you try and bypass Brussels, it's much more difficult rather, to get the kinds of things that you want and to use those as leverage to get a better deal with the EU. But I think the assumption, a reasonable assumption, is that the UK will want to have a strong foreign and security relationship with the EU, but it's quite possible that the institutional and organisational questions may get in the way of that, or may complicate that, because if you look at the way that the relationship is going to unfold over the next little while in the foreign security policy area, as with other areas of the EU's relationship to the UK, assuming a withdrawal agreement is made, the UK enters into a transition phase relationship with the EU on foreign and security policy questions. There may well be a new EU-UK agreement on the foreign and security policy area, and if there is, there may well be some provisional implementation period. But the relationship is going to shift inevitably after March, even if the interests don't shift, and if the positions on both sides don't shift. And if you look at transition, the best way to describe it, I don't know whether this works. There's a dance in English called in the UK called the okie kokie. You put your arm in, your arm out, your leg in, your leg out. I don't know whether you have the same in Norway. Probably far more sophisticated dancers than we are in the UK. But essentially, the UK is in EU foreign policy, but it's out because it's committed, or is committing itself to holding to EU foreign policy lines for the transition period, but it's out of the institutions. And ditto with the CSDP. In effect, the UK is performing what I call a reverse Denmark, because it's in CSDP, but it's out of decision-making institutions, right? And it's already seen a process where the UK is coming out of the battle groups, ending its role in providing the operational headquarters for Atalanta. It's not one of the signatories to PESCO, so on. The UK is in this strange limbo type condition when it comes to EU foreign and security policy making. If you're an optimist, a deal will be done during the transition process, and a new arrangement will be put in place which ends the UK's zombie-like status within foreign and security policy cooperation, and which could come into force during the transitional period, so in advance of the new economic relationship being set. And that's accepted on the part of both sides. But equally, if the UK does not get the withdrawal agreement, is not able to ratify the withdrawal agreement, then the UK becomes locked out overnight from all of that cooperation, so-called hard Brexit. But if you look at the other models, and I think the sort of UK position on what it might be like to be a third party once you get through transition or beyond transition, none of the offerings look attractive to the UK. The Canada deal is very heavily codified. If you look at Canada's relationship, strategic partnership agreement with the EU, it's very codified in terms of just the agreement that's made, and it appears very routinized from the outside. It's very expansive, but at the same time, it's very mechanistic, I would suggest. The relationship with the USA is much less heavily codified, in fact, rather light touch, I would say, but has a very high tempo. The relationship that Norway has with the EU, if I may say so, is what I call institutionally light, L-I-T-E, as in the sense of an American beer. Looks like a beer, tastes like a beer, but it doesn't have the same effect. In that you are involved, but you don't have the same kick that you get from being a member. And none of those options are attractive for the UK. In fact, what the UK really wants is it wants a kind of high-tempo relationship that's quite institutionalised. And that's not one which is on offer from the EU so far, and not one which has a proven track record. So what is negotiated out over the transition period after the withdrawal agreement, this period that lasts until 2020, is also going to be sort of testing the limits in terms of how the EU is willing to push out from its existing third-party relationships in this area in which the UK has quite a lot to offer. The UK has been quite valuable to other member states. The stars should be aligned for cooperation, but will it be the case that it's just too difficult to make it work institutionally and practically in a way that will satisfy the UK and will allow the EU to preserve the idea that there is a distinction between a member state and a non-member state. So in summary, I think there isn't an attractive template out there in terms of the foreign policy relationship. The UK's ambitions are greater than the EU's ambitions, which are quite limited at the moment, if you look at all of the negotiating documents. And the sort of British Prime Minister's ambition that you would have a sort of security deal wrapped up alongside the economic deal, where you have external and internal security alongside other security issues, and you can read the passages on this in the so-called Chequers document. And essentially, if you look in that, I mean, the kind of things that the UK is saying is, that we recognise that there are kind of plug-and-play problems, how we work together, but we need to be more ambitious, how you plug and play with the third country. No response on that, I think, yet from the EU. The UK is willing, in effect, to have a kind of lend-lease type relationship on some of its capabilities. If you look at things like sanctions, which are flagged up as an area in which the UK has quite a lot of capability, offered quite a lot to the EU in the past, and is willing to do so. But if you pick through, what the EU discussion has been so far, it's quite difficult to see how the British ambition to have a strategic relationship can be realised unless there is a shift or a rethink and understanding on the part of from the EU side. But if you're an optimist, you would say, well, once the UK is not a member and you get into these discussions, the context of the negotiations is different. There aren't the same issues at stake. But at the moment, it's really difficult to see how you will, how you get a deal that sort of satisfies certainly what the UK wants. But the problem doesn't stop there, because of course EU's foreign and security policy making is not a settled undertaking. It's one of those areas which arguably has the greatest amount of integrative dynamism at work at present, particularly on the defence side, and particularly since the articulation of the EU global strategy, and particularly now with the focus on the defence technical and industrial base. And those are things which would have been very difficult for the UK to deal with as a member state. It's going to be incredibly difficult for the UK to deal with as a third party when it's not involved in agenda setting. So it's quite possible that the deal that's struck, if a deal is struck in this area, is one that doesn't really satisfy Britain's interests, and one that leads on the UK side to doing, for example, venue shopping, going other places to try and get the same policy outcomes as you might get in the foreign policy area through working through Brussels. To go for much more organised ad hocery, which is already something which complicates EU decision making, but the UK, as it would see itself as a large European state, very enthusiastic about contact groups and other formulations to deal with big policy issues. And it seeks to have influence on EU foreign policy making through, what I call remote control measures, whether it's through NATO, whether it's through the G7 and the UN. In other words, if the EU track looks too difficult, if the EU track looks too bureaucratic, doesn't deliver value and delivers a lot of sort of formula without value, then the attractiveness of going elsewhere is probably going to increase. But also the UK is probably going to have to make some choices. Let's come back to a sort of connection with the global strategy bit, that the UK as a third party is not going to be able to do all the things that it does with the EU now. And there may well be some areas that the UK decides it's going to be a kind of a free rider on, or an easy rider. How much does the UK really care about the migration crisis? Bearing in mind that there's an awful lot of land between the UK and the EU, and it hasn't got this, it's outside of Schengen. It faces a different way of managing migration pressures from the ones that the other member states do. And where does the UK put into that project, or where does the EU make a contribution? I think to be discussed. But that then takes us to the question of, what the broader global Britain objectives are, and if Britain's not going to do X or can't do X, it's because it wants to do Y. And as I say, I'll come back to that in a moment. So I've spent a lot of time on the EU strategy because it is the number one determinant of how the UK's European strategy will evolve over the next little while. Focusing on that foreign security policy area, I think, is a very nice encapsulation of some of the problems that exist in getting the relationship to work in a way that the UK will feel is advantageous, and it won't be encouraged to think about a sort of European strategy which has a rather different characteristic. But essentially, Britain's strategy towards Europe has three aspects. It has the security aspect, it has the political economy aspect, and those two are being worked through at the moment, but it also has the identity aspect. You know, how much does the UK think of itself as being a European power, European state, however you want to articulate it? How far does it see itself doing and thinking in different ways? Because outside the EU and just the act of leaving the EU, the UK is mentally remapping Europe. You know, as a third-party, non-member state, the UK's public administration, the UK's key resource allocation considerations when it comes to third country relationships, and its sense of its place in the world inevitably change by being a non-member state. And so its thinking about Europe at the moment is predominantly concerned with the EU, but there are other aspects to the current UK European strategy, and the EU is just one component of that. There's obviously the relationship with NATO, which I won't dwell on because that's probably well known in this audience, but there's also the bilateral, the trilateral, the minilateralism that the UK has with countries in Europe, both EU member states, but also non-EU member states. And the EU strategy fits in there, but the degree to which the EU strategy is the driver will depend on what kind of relationship the UK has with the EU. And, you know, historically, Britain has felt most comfortable with the idea of doing bilateralism. It's felt most comfortable with the idea of having sets of bilateral relationships which allow Britain to focus on preoccupations outside of Europe. This cartoon is a cartoon called The Plum Pudding in Danger. You probably can't see all the resolution, but you've got Napoleon who's carving up Europe. He's his sphere of influence. You could probably fix Macron's head on there if you want to be rather cheeky. And this is William Pitt the Younger. And Britain's carving off the high seas. Yeah. And in effect, this tension between, you know, Britain as a European-focused power and Britain as a wider power has come through in the referendum discussion, in this idea of global Britain. You know, Britain can't leave the bilateral behind, but, you know, what's the bilateral relationships? What are bilateral relationships for? You know, how do they fit into the bigger picture? And Britain, I think, is almost certainly going to be interested in its bilateral relationships in working out who are the privileged partners and for what purpose. And those are likely to be pursued through the security and defence policy offering, because other European states don't have much to offer the UK when it comes to a trade policy offering, because their trade policy is run out of Brussels, most European states. But that's also going to run up against questions about how far the EU becomes a defence policy actor, and therefore how much can be done bilaterally. So there's quite a lot of work going on now in terms of thinking about what the niches are and the way in which you can press hard on this. So, you know, there is active diplomacy with Poland, with Germany, and with others to try and develop the defence policy relationship, which is, you know, looking beyond the Brexit date. I mean, this is not to gain advantage in the Brexit negotiations, but it's to think about this. And if I had to encapsulate what I think the British approach will be alongside the EU relationship, is what I would call promiscuous bilateralism. You know, that the UK will not seek to have a sort of a set partner. I mean, the UK's tried that within the EU. It different times, as I say, tried to break into the Franco-German relationship. But the UK is going to need strong bilateralism, but it's also going to struggle to make each of those relationships feel special. How many special relationships can you have when they cease to be special? Yeah. And for what purposes are those relationships special? So I think it's probably going to move, be some privileged partners, but there's also going to be some tactical bilateral relationships where I think the UK thinks it can get some short-term advantage. But what's absolutely certain is, the great paradox post-Brexit is Europe is probably going to exercise or take up a lot more bandwidth on the part of British diplomacy than it has in the past, because dropping out of the EU means you lose the efficiency gains that you got from dealing with lots of countries on the same issue through Brussels at the same time, however frustrating that may have been. So to sort of, wrap things up and close things off, the European strategy and the EU strategy have to be considered against the global strategy. And this strapline logo now is applied to anything the British government says. It doesn't have a trademark associated with it, so I think anybody can call themselves global. But global Britain is front and centre if you look at government communications, which is supposed to, of course, convey the idea that Britain's not becoming isolationist as it leaves the EU. But at the same time, it throws up some pretty big questions about Britain's place in the world, which is why, as the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons has discovered, as it's investigated the idea of global Britain, is that actually it's really difficult to tangibly articulate what it is as an idea and how it informs the allocation of resources. And this is at a moment in which there is what I'd call the UK's other union problem, which is the union of the United Kingdom. So there's the problem with the European Union going on there, and there's the problem with the union of the United Kingdom. And the tensions which Brexit has thrown up, which will not dissipate with and through the withdrawal. I mean, not least because most of what the British government has done on its Brexit negotiations has been London-driven so far, largely ignoring the different aspirations when it comes to the Scottish government and obviously when it comes to Northern Ireland, not having an executive there at the moment. So there is a problem, that the UK is going to have to grapple with as it makes the idea of global Britain. Because what Britain is going global, and the fact that the devolved administrations want to have a say about Britain's place in the world. And at the moment, they stand for quite different models in their relationship with the EU. Anyway, what you have seen, and where you do see a kind of nascent thinking about Britain's future, is essentially to go back to the future, to go back to the idea that comes out in chapter 1 of every book on British foreign policy that's been written since the Second World War, which is to talk about Churchill's three circles, to talk about Europe, a united Europe, which Britain contributes but is not an integral player, to talk about the relationship with the Commonwealth, and to talk about the relationship with the English-speaking world. And the active discussion around think tanks and commentators in the UK now on the global Europe question is probably more active on the issue of the relationship between the so-called CANZAC, the relationship with US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and that as a sort of coherent grouping, partly or in large part because it's already held together by the security relationship that those countries have through the Five Eyes Agreement, but also as another vehicle, a ready-made vehicle for striking new trade deals and for thinking about the way in which British defence policy might evolve, and we can pick up that on discussion. But there are, of course, other competing visions, or there are other products out there. The relationship with the United States, which has also gone through a shock experience for the UK over the last 2 years, is it an interregnum? And will you see the older relationship re-established? Watch this space. Will the UK think of itself as a middle power, a European-based middle power? And middle powers face constraints. Middle powers search out niches for themselves. Yeah? And what is that niche for the UK? It's quite regular in the UK, you'd have competitions where you had to say in less than 20 words your answer to the question. So global Britain is in 20 words. The UK is a middle power, but what do you do as a middle power outside of a large, important regional grouping? And by the way, if Britain had a sort of brand up until the Brexit vote, it was to be a good multilateralist. It's now leaving a major multilateral structure. So what does that do to the brand? And of course, it's quite possible that with political developments in the UK, that you will have the question of the relationship with the EU, making the relationship closer, rejoining the EU if the UK leaves, as being a perennial issue in British politics, one that could be an issue of differentiation between European countries, between political parties in the UK. Quickly, in the last 30 seconds, where has British thinking gone in terms of the future on its European strategy or not? All of these government documents are worth taking a look at for the degree to which the EU features. Not a lot is the short answer. If you're looking for the single most important determinant of what British foreign policy does in Europe and elsewhere, it's probably this: what resources the government is willing to provide when it comes to foreign policy. And it's also who is going to articulate this vision. Where is the new thinking going to come from? And one of the things which is unsettled as a consequence of Brexit focusing entirely on Brexit is that the UK is not thinking about post-Brexit and ideas about post-Brexit to any significant degree. And as British foreign policy has been traditionally driven from the centre, and as we have at the moment a weak Prime Minister, then that may give third parties a bit of cause for concern in terms of grip when it comes to British foreign policy. But Britain has some significant resources, and we could run through each of these if we had time. But essentially, Britain has to make a decision as to how it wants to allocate what's probably a shrinking pot of treasure for foreign policy in Europe and beyond. The story of British foreign policy, or British foreign security policy over the last couple of decades is a period of austerity and now an uptick for spending on defence to keep within the 2% commitment, maintained spending on development policy. That raises problems for the EU, but raises interesting questions about cooperation with third parties, and a ever declining spend on diplomacy. And even in the upcoming the budget settlement, another 100 million taken off the Foreign Office budget. Can you do a developing, expansive, ambitious foreign policy in Europe and beyond while you're cutting the budget? And lastly, stuff. I've sort of spoken about, in a very academic way about, Britain articulating a European policy that fits with its EU policy, that fits with its international policy. But there are lots of domestic factors that will be in play when it comes to Britain being able to sort out for itself what it wants in its relationship with the world outside. And ditto the external. What factors are going to come in play that will actually constrain Britain in terms of the limits of possibility within Europe and beyond. And, of course, there's also the question, which is for somebody else to talk about, because I'm soon to be persona non grata within the EU, which is the EU is not in a settled state. And Brexit has certainly masked many of the problems that the EU has, which are unsettled. But, that's another talk for another day with another speaker, I think. But, that's something that Britain will have to adjust itself to. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Richard, for a very interesting and a comprehensive presentation about the possible future UK foreign policy after Brexit. I think you made a very interesting distinction in the beginning that we have to distinguish between this process that we are in now, negotiating the Brexit, and after. And I think that will probably change a lot the discussion about both UK's foreign policy and global Britain as such, but also how the UK can relate itself to EU's foreign policy. I think there will be a new discussion after the Brexit has actually taken place, I guess. And also, and you can maybe say something about that, because now in the EU now, there is a process towards more flexible integration, one could say, in the area of foreign and security policy. Of course, there are things happening at the EU level, but also things are happening outside, like the European Intervention Initiative, where UK is actually in. So there might be other possibilities to link up to a European security policy without kind of the institutional. It might be excluded from the institutional cooperation, but it might be included in other processes. So you can maybe say something about that, but I will first give the floor to our Brexit specialist on at NUPI, Kristin Haugevik, who will have the floor first, and then you can sign up for questions, the rest of you, if you have questions.
So thank you very much, Richard, for this very informative and very interesting talk. You mentioned how the UK and the EU are already shifting their identities in relation to one another. And of course, already from March, the UK will no longer be a rule maker in Brussels, it will be a rule taker. And I read in the newspaper the other day that the EU is already preparing to have a new embassy in London. It's sort of, there's a bid to be the new ambassador to the UK. So I was wondering if you could give us some reflection in terms of how the British diplomatic apparatus are adapting to this new situation. Are they already sort of thinking about themselves in terms of this third country identity? And then secondly, since you mentioned the privileged partners, I was wondering, which privileged partners do you think that will be? Who will be on top of the UK's list in terms of the partners that one will form new ties with? Will, for instance, the Nordic countries be high on that list? Will it be the Eastern European countries, and so on? Thank you.
Those are great questions. Thank you very much. I mean, I think the adjustment process, it's interesting if you look at Brexit in a case study, is how public administration deals with a political problem. And what the British government decided to do was to create a new structure to negotiate Brexit, to create a new department, DEXEU, Department for Exiting the EU, which it drew in expertise from across the civil service. And I think a question to ask will be, why was the exercise not driven by the Foreign Office, for example? The Foreign Office has a relatively small role in Brexit negotiations, covering a fairly small number of dossiers, which are to do with security and defence policy, British overseas territories, for example. But most of the other legwork, in effect, is being done from expertise from other bits of Whitehall. And the process has essentially been driven around the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Office. Part of that has been through politics. We had a particularly poor Foreign Secretary. And at the same time, it's obviously been driven by what is a tendency which is clear in other EU member states to centralise EU decision-making, generally in and around the Prime Minister's office, and foreign ministries have lost out in general across the EU. And the UK is no different in that way. In terms of where things go, one of the things I'm surprised about is how having been a member for so long, how relatively easy it is to reorganise your foreign policy operation to detach yourself from the EU. In that there's a fairly small number of people within the Foreign Office who, if you like, are sort of permanently plugged in. The Foreign Office is involved in general, but a fairly small number of people who are permanently plugged in, either at home or in third countries. And, the way that thinking is evolving is obviously there has to be a resource reallocation. And Britain's going to open new embassies. I mean, that's the headline news. It's going to have new embassies in Africa. It's 10 new embassies, I think, are due to open in the short term. But it's obviously going to have to put more resources into Brussels. Perm rep there is going to be larger than it is now. Whether it will be as important a posting, we'll obviously have to wait and see. It will depend on the relationship. And who it's headed by. Will it be headed by a career diplomat, or will it be headed by somebody from another ministry? And that will tell us quite a lot about the relative power balance within the UK when it comes to dealing with the EU as a foreign policy issue, or is the EU thought about as a different kind of issue? So the UK has already reorganised itself with Brexit. So we have DexEU, we have a new Department for International Trade, which is anticipating trade deals. And the Foreign Office has in effect had bits shaved off it to deal with that. We have another powerful actor, which I haven't mentioned so far, which is DFID, and the development spend, which is a major part of the UK's overseas commitment, 0.7% of GNI, which is enshrined in law. And that's something that's not going to disappear as far as the UK's sort of overseas commitments are concerned. But what's the package and what's the ribbon? How do all of these things... how are they all organised for purpose in terms of what the UK wants? And I think the question of what the UK's relationship with the EU is central to being clear about not just the resource allocation questions, how much money the UK may be putting in, not just to honour its budget commitments, but also how much it wants to be allied in other areas. But at the same time, how Britain thinks about how it might want to organise itself for activity beyond the UK. And I think there's this very strong case for looking at bringing DFID under much more direct control of the Foreign Office. But then what's the relationship with the Department for International Trade? And there's one model, which is the Canadian model, which is much more integrated and may or may not be a good model for the UK. But that discussion hasn't really got going, I would say. So I think you're already, the UK is already starting to think about how it organises itself for life as a non-member state. But at the same time, the bigger questions as to how it fits within Europe are not really being interrogated sufficiently. And I would say where there have been attempts to sort of have a thinking exercise with other member states or with people from other countries, the answer that's generally come back is the questions that you ask in terms of how our future relationship might be organised are generally answered by, well, that comes through Brussels, which is, one of the reasons why the UK is going to have a strong EU-focused operation, and the question will be where it's located and how it's located and for what purpose and so on. Maybe I could come to back to the other bits in other answers.
One question here.
My name is William Bond. I'm here as a interested bystander. My question to you is actually to give you a little pushback on some of your positions. You were mentioning you had this red and blue fan, which was talking about internal domestic issues in the UK. And I think smarter people than I have said that all politics is local, and such it is also for the EU. And that the people in Brussels are quite aware that they are facing disintegration, which the UK is a proponent for. They have revolt in Poland, revolt in Czechia, revolt in Hungary, revolt in Italy. Spain is not functioning, Greece isn't functioning. They need to actually take a hard stand against the UK in this question so that the whole thing doesn't devolve. So it's clear that they're taking the position that they are towards the UK, and I would argue in the other position that the UK is doing the right thing by not giving in. There's no reason why they should give in either. And as you mentioned, a key issue is the security. European security without the UK is non-existent. There are more people in the UK in the armed forces. There's more capacity in the UK armed forces. And the leader of any EU forces will have to be a UK person. It can never be French, it can never be a German, it cannot be an Italian, it could be a Spanish per se, but these countries do not have anything to come with, and Europe will not accept that we're going to buy German military goods without them contributing either, which they're not. So my question to you is, isn't the UK actually doing the right things in every way, shape, and form?
It may well be doing the right things. I'm not sure whether it's organised itself in the best way to maximise an effective outcome from the negotiations. And I'm sure that a lot of attention will be given in the future on Brexit as a case study as to how you negotiate with the EU. And I think what's very clear, if you look at very big mistakes the UK made in terms of wrestling the negotiations in a direction that would have allowed the UK to have more advantage and to realise, some of those capabilities that it has, would have been not to invoke Article 50 until the UK was really clear about what it wanted from the negotiations, because the UK has simultaneously been negotiating with itself at the same time as it's been negotiating with the EU, which has been a sort of, fatally undermine the energy and effort that it's been able to put into the Brexit negotiations. But, that was, Article 50 was invoked for domestic political reasons and Conservative Party management reasons, essentially by Theresa May. And I could have imagined a different structure to the negotiations if the UK had held off and decided to have a bigger conversation in the UK about what it wanted. I mean, the process of making a lot of legislation in European countries is you have a discussion phase. We have a green paper phase where you publish ideas and then there's discussion around it and then it turns into legislation. That would have been better for the UK. We would have thrashed out, is EEA good? Is Canada bad? How the security bit could be leveraged, or to use it in less sort of provocative terms, how it could have been advantaged for the UK in a way that would make clear to the other member states what the UK contribution would be or what it wouldn't be. I mean, the sort of the points you make about sort of evolving EU defence agenda, I think fit with your question about the sort of model within Europe and the sort of one of flexible or flexi security model, we might say, in terms of the contribution that member states might make, how they would fit in and so on. The problem for the UK in this area is that the UK has a huge amount to contribute in terms of capability, in terms of commitment, in terms of practice. The problem is that it has a very devalued currency with other member states, because the constant refrain you hear when you talk to people about the British contribution to EU as opposed to European security is that, well, look, you haven't made much of a contribution to CSDP, you've dragged your feet, you've always been hostile to any idea of evolving CSDP in a way that would be advantageous to meet the needs or aspirations of member states that want to have more integration and so on. And that's something which has made it more difficult to make the argument that the UK can make a really positive contribution as an outsider. Probably the tragedy may be for the UK that EU defence develops in a way which is not good for the UK, but the UK has little or no say on the way that evolves, and it ends up not adding up to very much in terms of whether PESCO adds up to something, whether the Commission as a defence spender or a quasi-defence spender, and so on and so on. And the UK just gets interested in other things and goes elsewhere, either with the US, with other European states. And I think if you looked on my diagram, I had got Berlin bracketed and I had London, Paris in terms of key bilateral relationship, and very much in mind with defence cooperation between the UK and France, because there are other avenues to pursue that, and you've already got that bilateral relationship in the defence policy area, which is absolutely something that Britain is going to press on with. So the question is going to be, how much does Paris value that, separate and separable from what its ambitions are in Brussels? And that's probably going to be determined by what Germany might put in. So there's quite a lot there through the bilateral that the UK is going to press very, very hard on. But I suspect that some member states are going to want to keep a firewall between that and EU policy. And have been very clear in their view that the UK should not use its defence contribution, however you measure that, as leverage for a better deal when it comes to the economic relationship. And that's partly about institutional actors, it's partly about personalities, but I think it's also, frankly, partly about sort of bad handling on the part of Britain in the way that it's marshalled its forces for the diplomacy of Brexit, I'm afraid.
I just want to comment on that, because it's clear that EU is very concerned that UK can use that as a leverage now before Brexit. But once Brexit has kind of happened, I think it will be easier. And if you look at France, who has chosen a very different strategy, kind of building its power and influence through the EU, but at the same time they are doing two things. They are supporting PESCO and the institutionalized European security, but they are also kind of developing something outside, because France is very eager to have its kind of that the EU is ready to act, and they are a bit skeptical of kind of the long process within the EU that actually you don't really need to manage to intervene when you have to.
Yeah.
And in that area, Britain will kind of be a very valued partner.
Yeah.
And also, if you look at the whole integration process in this area, I mean, you can say that Britain has dragged its feet and been a bit skeptical about especially duplicating NATO and so on. But at the same time, they have been instrumental in developing CSDP.
Yeah.
I mean, the Saint-Malo meeting was initially started between France and Britain. So everything started, and Britain has supported the kind of the main process. So I think that, and many things is happening. And I don't really agree with you that the only Britain is the only military power, because, I mean, without France, you wouldn't have anything of European security. They have pushed the agenda the whole time. So I think that is an important, but Britain has also supported that. So I think that it will be interesting to follow what will actually happen. And I think flexible integration is the key term in this area.
Yeah. I mean, the great British tragedy maybe is that it didn't get the French to run its strategy. I mean, because what you described would have been the best strategy for the UK to run through the EU. But that's partly where the domestic politics come in, I think, and represent a constraint for the UK. But it's why I also think that we're about to enter in a much more active period of bilateralism within the EU, unilateralism, I mean, it's, of course, there's plenty that goes on at the moment, but it's going to have a very different complexion once the UK is outside. And it's also partly conditioned by what the US does in this area, of course, because, if the US is not making the same kind of contribution that it has made, then in a way, what you don't want is sort of Britain to be distracted by other undertakings. And with some of the capabilities it's now developing, that there's more of an enthusiasm to go where the water's warm, rather than where the water is cold. Having the QE2 carrier class coming in service, sort of refreshed expeditionary warfare interest and so on, whilst at the same time obviously countering Russia. But just to think about the bigger picture, you're going to have three large European states: Russia, UK and Turkey, which are outside of the EU, and there is no realistic prospect of any one of those being a member of the EU in the foreseeable future, assuming,
But there is a prospect that the UK will be closely associated,
Yes,
and the other two will not.
That's what we would reasonably expect, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the script that we would want to write. But, it's perfectly possible that if the EU-UK thing goes badly wrong on the trade side, that, for reasons of domestic political constraint and for reasons of, the emergence of some kind of myth around the fact that the UK was done over by the EU, that, that constrains what you can do and what you can't do with the EU.
Do you have one follow-up on that? Yeah.
I'm a big supporter of the Thatcher view of EU, by which I mean that she was constructive, positive, but said we need to fix things before we move ahead. And I would argue that one of the big issues that the shopkeeper, I love stereotypes, shopkeepers of the UK, they are not the fancy diplomats that you have in France and Spain and Austria and Italy, but they are men of action, and they see this doesn't work. We've been trying to fix the EU, it doesn't work, we have to leave. And they act without thinking too much further about it, but they are negotiating well, I would argue.
Different views on that. But Marianne has next question.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for an excellent talk on a very complicated issue. I have two questions, and the first one is linked to what you ended with right now, because I was wondering about the impact of all different kinds of external factors on this whole picture, and if the UK really can fall back on NATO and the US in today's geopolitical landscape, in a sense, because it's not only about Trump, it's also about, of course, Russia being much more aggressive, and the US pivot to Asia has been gone on much longer than Trump, for example. So I was wondering if you could say more about how you think these kind of external factors play into this picture, and if maybe these factors together are pushing the UK really towards the EU, and also, of course, Turkey. I mean, Turkey is not maybe not that much of a reliable NATO partner in the long run. But so if you could comment on that. And I also have a question about the EU, actually, because you said that the EU member states have been very quiet when it comes to foreign and security policy relations with the UK. And is this an indication of the strength of the CFSP? Because after all, the CFSP is intergovernmental, and I would assume that many of the EU member states have strong interest in having a strong relationship with the UK also after Brexit in terms of security. But still, they remain quiet and following the EU. And so if you could comment on that as well. Thank you.
Maybe to take the last point first. I mean, I've spent quite a long time looking at the CFSP, sort of 2.5 decades. And I think one of the striking things for me about the CFSP is that, essentially, it is still primarily an instrument for reconciling the positions of the member states rather than projecting the EU's interests in the most effective way possible. And that's absolutely fine, if the primary purpose of the system is, to actually work out what the collective views are, or try and forge common positions. But it's also a bit tricky when it comes to the EU success stories, and I think it's quite reasonable to ask what has been achieved even when the extra resource has gone into EU foreign policy making since the Lisbon Treaty, and whether the outcomes have been what one might have reasonably expected with that extra allocation. And by the way, foreign ministers certainly probably a bit more sidelined in the process than they have been in the past, and that's been a loss in terms of capability. And that sort of takes me to your kind of bigger questions, which is essentially what's the most effective vehicle to do diplomacy as Europeans in a context of systemic change. And for the UK, it's you just look at those documents that I flagged up in terms of capabilities review and so on. The readout is the same readout as you would get in most other European capitals. And that means that the UK's core interests are going to be aligned with other Europeans. But what we're going to have is a disjuncture in the institutional architecture, aren't we? In a way that that you wouldn't have invented to try and maximise the way in which you can essentially caucus and you can act collectively in ways that address those collective problems. And for the UK, in the past, there was always that safety net or security or comfort blanket of the United States. And that now is less certain than it was. And because the UK has invested so much in the relationship with the United States in terms of the intelligence and security partnership that it has, Brexit, the upside of Brexit, I would say, is that it means the UK hasn't gone neurotic about transatlantic relations, because it hasn't had enough space and time to think about transatlantic relations. You get the other side of Brexit, And you know, the UK really is going to be asking itself some hard questions, I think, about the relationship with the US, particularly if it looks like you're going to get a Trump second term. And does that then lead to a sort of boomerang back to wanting to do more with Europeans, but you haven't got the EU vehicle, and you know, the kind of questions about what the other fora are that in and around the EU then start to come into play much more, don't they? And that sort of flexible integrated model, which is about in EU member states and non-EU member states, becomes a way of doing business that needs to be perhaps firmed up a bit more to make it a way of handling the transition from a US just being much less interested in dealing with the collective security problems that Europeans have, and the US is just unwilling to make the contribution to than it has done in the past. You know, the UK is is facing a position which is pretty unusual for a state to face, which is, you know, both your magnetic north and south in your foreign policy have both gone haywire. So, you know, how do you orientate yourself? One way you could orientate yourself is to look inward. You become more isolationist. And that's why the government, even though people laugh about this global Britain strapline, I mean, that is supposed to be a signal to outsiders that Britain wants to be engaged internationally. It's not inward. It's not inward looking. But it's perfectly possible, for reasons of domestic political constraint or for reasons of economic stress, that the UK is forced to be much more inward looking. I mean, we've already had the Syria vote for the UK, which was a clear indication that on the part of the sort of parliamentary elite, that British governments cannot assume that Parliament would support military operations that they have supported in the recent past. And if there's one, you know, good topic to look at over the next little while, it's the way in which British parliamentarians, British policymakers, how they're going to remap the world, you know, mentally remap the world in terms of their relationships and you know, what they consider to be important, and those countries that they see as, you know, being the kind of privileged partners by virtue of the ways that they think you should develop this new sort of European strategy, I think.
Add to that, it's very difficult to understand what global Britain would mean, which is not, if it's not something that it's very similar to the EU policy.
Yeah.
Because of course, I mean, there are normative, shared norms and values there that will be difficult for the UK. So what will be kind of an alternative that is not lining up with the US and Trump's policies of more protectionism and isolationism? Is there a third way that could be acceptable? It's very difficult for me, at least, to see what that will be. So in the end, it will actually be something like what Norway is doing is actually lining up with everything that the EU is doing in foreign and security policy without being a member. And for Britain, it will be more explicit as a great country.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and you could say, I mean, you know, to be hard on the UK, I mean, you know, is the UK going to be Pepsi to the EU's Coke? You know, you basically it's the same thing with a different label. But you know, this is where I think the domestic politics is quite important. I mean, if you were to have a Corbyn government elected in the UK, there will be a very interesting tussle then around, you know, what British foreign policy is and what British foreign policy is for, and that will be taking place in a context in which, you know, as I say, the sort of magnetic stabilizers have disappeared, and it could be taking place in a context in which, you know, the EU looks much more can be presented as a hostile entity for the UK because the negotiations collapsed. You know, we could argue about where, you know, there will be arguments about where the blame lies. But Britain is a very cleaved society. I mean, not just the referendum result, but if you look at social attitude surveys, I mean, essentially the public is split between what you might call the sort of cosmopolitans, which are essentially outward-looking, comfortable with globalization, comfortable with immigration, and so on, and more conservative with a small c, which is, you know, more traditional views about identity, much more comfortable with sort of traditional definitions of what it means to be British, and so on. And those values were very important in deciding how people voted in the Brexit referendum. And those don't go away with the Brexit vote. I mean, arguably, they reinforce that distinction, if you like, between those two tribes. And then how that relates to your relationship with the outside world. Normally, British governments have had quite a free hand in foreign security and defence policy. It's been an elite-led project. If you look back in Britain's history, there are not many good recent examples where British governments have really been sort of constrained, held back by public opinion. The Iraq War didn't matter. You had the largest ever public demonstration on the streets of Britain. The British government still went ahead with the war there. Vietnam War is probably the most recent example where you can see a constraint on British government action as a consequence of a public unease plus elite sentiment, which sort of chimed with the public view. And at the moment, my number one worry about the Brexit process and what it's exposed is the poor understanding on the part of parliamentarians as to the understanding of quite big issues. And I know that's not just a problem in the UK; it's a problem in other political systems. But in Britain, we've essentially had an elite parliamentary consensus on what foreign policy is for. That should not be taken for granted. And if you were to have a prime minister, who is somebody who has a background in basically wanting to see NATO fold and wanting to see, Britain give up its strategic nuclear deterrent, that's a different prime minister from every other prime minister we've had since 1945. And something's got to give, isn't it? There. It's not, it's the polls. The polls, are pretty dead set and have been for a long time. Whether it will be elected, I mean, I'm surprised Labour did so well at the last general election. Right?
We're a bit over time, but I
Yeah.
will allow still two more questions, very, very short ones. One here and there. Yeah. 3 short.
My name is Tone Rand. Thank you for a most interesting presentation. I would appreciate your views on the following. To which extent do you think it is realistic to imagine that Brexit will influence CFSP, and not the least the relationship between NATO and the EU? And I would also be interested in knowing your views concerning the role which the Franco-German axis could play in the future. And then if I could ask you to look into the crystal ball, do you think there might be a second referendum? And what might be the outcome of such a referendum? Thank you.
I'm assuming the second referendum question is the second referendum about EU membership.
Take the two more questions just to then you can...
Rather than Scottish independence. Because I think a second referendum on Scotland is more... Yeah.
We have to stick to the... I'm sorry. We have to stick to the...
Just a final question.
Okay.
David Llewellyn, final question. One of the selling points of Brexit was free trade with Africa, was controlling immigration. But in fact, I understand the EU's done a free trade deal with Africa. The immigration problem in Europe is reducing. There seems to be much more control of it. Is it the case that the Brexit argument's actually being overtaken by events?
I mean, to take the last part of the question in your question, I think the answer is yes, but it's whether there's the sort of constellation of political processes is such that it allows for a rethink and or a recalibration. I mean, I can't see anything that would lead to Conservative members of Parliament putting themselves in a position to trigger a general election. And I think it's unlikely we'll get a second referendum in the UK unless you have a general election and a party stands, as the Labour Party would stand, on a platform for a second election. So I think we are, the timetable of the Brexit process, with the March departure with or without a deal, is something that is much more likely to condition what happens to the UK. But what's clear is that there is still lots of possibility for the political turbulence, domestic political turbulence, which complicates the way that the government negotiates and complicates whether the government will be able to do a deal. And if I had to put any money on what will happen, is I think the government will squeak through in getting a withdrawal agreement, but it will get most of its trouble on the future relationship articulation, the declaration, the political declaration. And we were talking about this before lunch, and it's not clear whether there will be two parliamentary votes, one on the withdrawal agreement and one on the accompanying political declaration. And that for me, that could be where you end up. And bearing in mind the government will say its manifesto has committed itself to leaving, it will use that as a way to whip members of parliament through. And remember, it's supported by the Democratic Unionist Party, which is a party which opposed the Good Friday Agreement. And therefore its position on Northern Ireland questions is a bit different from others. So we've got so much now hangs on the Northern Ireland deal. But to the question about sort of, CFSP and so on, and the great unknowable really is, what impact the UK departure will have on the kinds of things that get tabled within the CFSP, how the process works, and the configuration of forces for the revision of the CFSP. Whether there's an argument for strengthening institutions, which Mr. Juncker has made in his State of the Union address, how much support there is for that. Or it's quite possible that you could see the foreign policy making process in the EU atrophy. That it ends up being something which, it continues to deliver things that are quite similar to what it delivers on now, but actually a lot more energy and effort goes in on the defence side. And that, that might be something of a paradox, actually, because the Commission as a becoming more of a driver. And I think you've already seen with the global strategy that because the global strategy has set these objectives that are reported on, and the High Rep has this interest in pushing the agenda forward, that's given a momentum on the defence side that was not there previously. And I think, for historians, there's going to be that very happy conjunction for historians of Europe, the global strategy and Brexit, both arriving at the same time, and these two different trajectories for Europe, and telling these stories about, how they relate to one another or not. And I think that's really for me the kind of area to watch. So as much as I'm fascinated by Brexit or horrified, at the same time, I'm absolutely fascinated by what's going to happen in terms of EU defence integration. I mean, I think it's a really interesting time to be thinking about that. And for third countries, are we going to be bystanders? Are we going to be able to influence the process? Are we going to be able to backseat drive through NATO? All of these questions.
And it's very good to stop here, because the next seminar that we will have will actually be on that, how third countries, what are the possibilities from a legal point of view when it comes to associate third countries. Our researcher here, or Professor Christopher Jung, who is French and is associated researcher here, will talk about that.
I'll watch the podcast then.
You can watch the podcast. 23rd of October. He will be talking about that.
When are your bankers coming?
Sorry?
When are your bankers coming?
Bankers.
The city.
Oh yeah. Okay. And we will not have a seminar on that, but that is also an issue, of course.
Yeah.
If you're talking about city and where city will move.
The whole world out there
That's true.
full guns.
Of course. Yeah.
I'd hoped you would have some time for that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We are a bit over time, so I think we have to stop there.
Yeah. Next time.
Next time. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.